Here's a story about two great big dumb athletes. Two coaches were debating which one had the dumbest athlete. And the football coach said, I got the dumbest athlete that ever lived. Basketball coach said, I don't care how dumb your athlete is, I got a basketball player that's even dumber. So they made a bet, and the football coach said, watch this. He said, hey, Pete. And this great big 300-pound football player came up. Bam, bam, he hits both sides of the door and comes in and says, yes, sir. And the coach says, here's a quarter. Go down and buy me a Cadillac. Yes, sir. And he grabs the quarter and goes running out. Football coach says, can you believe this? That guy thinks he can buy a Cadillac with a quarter. Basketball coach said, that ain't nothing. Watch this. Hey, Joe. And this great big tall basketball player comes in. Bam, he hits his head on the door and comes right up to the coach and says, yes, sir. He says, go down to my office and see if I'm there. Yes, sir. And out he goes. Bam, he hits his head on the door and he keeps going. The basketball coach says, can you believe that? That guy's going down to my office to see if I'm there, and I'm sitting right in front of him. How dumb can you get? So they're debating which one won the bet, and the two athletes meet out at the elevator, the great big football player and the great big tall basketball player. And the football player says, you know the pressure. My coach has been hit too many times. You know he gave me the money to buy him a car, but he didn't tell me what color he wanted. And the great big tall basketball player weaving says, you think that's bad? My coach is off his rocker. Do you know he sent me down to his office to see if he was there? Huh. He had a telephone he could have called and found out for himself. Well, the reason I tell this story is for two reasons. Number one, athletes are not all dumb, as the cliche is. And number two, they're not all 7 feet tall, and they're not all 300-pounders. We like to think in today's world that all these great athletes are great, big, gigantic guys or great, big, tall men with leverage, and this is what makes them. Actually, I want to shock you with a statistic. 95% of the champions I have known in 25 years of sports coverage and competition, 95% of the champions I've known are under 5 feet 10 and weigh 175 pounds. Now, I want to repeat that again. 95% of the champions in all sports are under 5 feet 10 and weigh 175 pounds. That means they're very average people, just like you and me. They're average guys, the same size, the same weight. They are average guys who become motivated. They get a dream, they get a goal, and they take their average abilities and go to the top. I believe there is genius in the average man. This is my theme tonight. There is genius in the average man. Now, this is part of the American heritage. Abraham Lincoln said, God must have loved the common man because he made so many of them. I'd like to paraphrase it and say this. God must have loved the average guy because he made so many of us. Now, I don't believe in the term genius per se. We like to excuse ourselves by saying if anyone's great, it's because they're endowed by nature with something we don't have. They've got a bigger brain, or they've got a bigger muscle, or they're more endowed at birth. There is genius in every man. There is genius in every person in this audience here tonight. One psychologist expressed my point of view this way. 99% of the people use 1% of their capacities. That means 99% of the people here tonight are operating on about 1% of the capacity within them. If I could get you using 2 or 3% of your capacity, they'd probably call you genius. This is what happens. Along comes a guy who uses some of his capacity and people say, oh, he's a genius. He's a genius. If I could just get you to utilize 5% of your great capacity, you could be regarded as a genius. William James, the father of American psychology, said this. He has never known anyone who put out 10% of his capacity. Never known anyone to put out 10%. Now, I know this is in contradistinction to the coach who says, my boys put out 110%. Well, now, that's a nice statement, but it doesn't really follow. Most of us have a vast reservoir of ability we never touch, we never discover. We go through life sitting on the most fantastic abilities in the world and never use them. It's the most amazing phenomena in life there is, that people don't use their capacities. Now, I want to try to get you using your capacities tonight. I want to try to get you motivated. And by the way, that's where a man does discover his capacity, when he becomes motivated. Now, what is your capacity? Do you, honest to God, know what your capacity is? Do you know what's within you? I read a statement the other day, for example, that said this: the human brain is the equivalent of 5 of the best computers in the world today. Within the average brain is the equivalent of 5 computers, and yet the man said this: less than 0.5% of brain power is ever used by the average person. This is the kind of ability we have, but we never use. It's only when we're motivated that this capacity comes out. Now, it's strange to see the various forms of motivation. We have motivation in love. I think it's amazing what guys will do when they fall in love. I think of the story of the boy in boot camp. He was getting long letters from his girl about how much she loved him and she missed him so much if she could only see him. Well, the sentry was on duty walking up and down in front of the guardhouse, had the big gun up. Here was the guardhouse. Bam! Here came this boy out of the barracks, running just as hard as he could, knees high, 9/300. He was going out of the army camp. Well, the sentry knew he didn't have leave, so he held up his hand and he cried out, "Halt!" And without missing one stride, this boy yelled back, "My mama's in heaven, my papa's in hell, my girl's in Chicago. I'm seeing one of them tonight." So now you see, that is motivation. When a guy's motivated like that, watch out, boy. He's going somewhere right now. But love is another source of tremendous motivation. Like the guy who went out with this gorgeous girl and he was just so flabbergasted he could hardly talk, turned off the ignition, looked out the window. Well, the girl was getting tired of the silence too, so she scooted over close to him and she laid her head on his shoulder, and with her great big brown eyes, she looked him right up into his eyes and she said, "You know, I could really get in the mood if the top was down." He was telling his roommate about it the next day. He said, "You know, it took me 20 minutes to get the top down on that stupid car of mine." Roommate said, "Oh, I don't understand. It only takes me 8 seconds on my convertible." He said, "Yeah, but my car wasn't a convertible." Well, you see, that's what a man can do. He can rip the top right off a car if he has to. Motivation. It's unbelievable what it does. When you want to be free, when you're fighting for a cause that you believe in with all your heart, it's amazing how you can exist. Viktor Frankl tells a story of the concentration camps, of how these people without food, beaten, sprayed with freezing water and freezing temperatures, how that these people survived. And he says, because they had the will to survive. Motivation. It discovers capacity that the average person never thought of. I was in Miami not too long ago, and we honored a salesman at American Sales Masters who's been in America for 2 years. He's a refugee from Cuba. I couldn't believe this story. Here was a guy who fought his way out of Cuba, was shot at in a boat, and got over to Miami. Now, he couldn't speak the language. Think of this. Didn't have any contacts, didn't know the cultural background of America, didn't know a soul. Didn't have a penny, no education, none of the things you and I have. Last year, he made over $400,000 selling in Miami. Now, if you were to go to people in Miami and say, "Can you sell $400,000 worth of products?" They'd say, "Oh, no, it can't be done. Not here in this town." They speak the language, they've got the contacts, they've got friends, they've got everything. But you see, it took a refugee coming over to Miami without any of these things to show what the capacity of a human being really is. You see, we can do these things. These things can happen. When a man becomes motivated, he discovers brain power, emotional power, willpower, physical power that he never thought he had. There is genius in every person here tonight. There is genius in the average man. That's what I want to try to get you to do. Now, in the sports world, you see it all the time. I can't believe some of the things I see in the sports world. I think of Jerry Kramer in his book, Instant Replay. He talks about playing with broken ribs, excruciating pain, goes back out on the field, drives to win the ball game. Perhaps there is no greater sports story than the one that comes out of Santa Clara, California. We've got a swimming team up there of just average kids. Average kids. I went up to speak to them after the Olympics last year, and I walked in and I couldn't believe my eyes. Here they were, 15 of them, average age 16. Their coach was sitting on my left, and I nudged him and I said, George, what's the secret of this fantastic bunch of kids? I couldn't believe it. The girls weighed 115 pounds, about 5'4", the average one. The greatest swimmer in the world, Mark Spitz, weighed 150 pounds, was 5 feet 10 inches tall. There he sat, 150 pounds, a little guy. Held about 8 world's records. I said, what's the secret of this bunch? Now, these kids weren't imported from all over the country. They were indigenous to that area, average kids. He said, come out and watch the workout. So I went out the next day, and I wish you could have seen those kids come out of locker rooms. I thought they might come out, oh, gee, I don't want to work out today. I'm tired. You want to get the picture? Out of that girls' locker room, these girls came, brrr, splash, brrr, splash. They could hardly wait to get in that water to train. Enthusiasm unbelievable. Little tiny 5-year-old kids are coming out of those locker rooms. Brrr, splash, brrr, splash. Do you know he's got those 5-year-old kids believing that they're going to break world's records when they grow up? Now get this, the record hasn't even been set yet. And they're going to break it. Now here's what staggers your mind. They do. What's the capacity of these little 5-year-old kids? Do you know what it is? There were 35 world's records behind me. I trained for 25 years to break a world's record. Never did. Oh, I got one, but I didn't get the big one. But here were 35 records behind me, and George Haynes apologized. He said, 3 of the records are out of date, but we haven't been able to make the plaques fast enough. Can you imagine having a club like that where you can't make the plaques fast enough to keep up with the world's records? They're motivated. They believe they can do it. They're average kids who have a dream. They go out and they do it. Here's this coach driving them, running up and down the sidelines. You can do 3 seconds better. Put out more. You can do it. Now, you think those kids would hate that guy's guts, wouldn't you? Lousy coach driving us all the time. I stood next to that coach after that speech as those kids came up, tears streaming down their faces. Kissed him, hugged him. They thanked him from the bottom of their hearts for what he had done for them. We got a wrong psychology about our kids today. We think if we give them everything, cars, education, clothes, they'll love us. It's not so. Young people only love their parents when their parents challenge them. A kid without a dream is a kid without purpose, without hope, without anything, and he'll turn to hate. These kids love a coach who makes them go. Everyone wants to be motivated. That's when you discover your capacity. Do any of you remember, speaking of swimming, do any of you remember Johnny Weissmuller, the great Tarzan of the Apes? Johnny Weissmuller was regarded at one time as the greatest swimmer who ever lived. 53 American records, about 17 world's records. I don't know how many gold medals in the Olympics. One sports writer I read said he's a super phenomena. No one will ever beat Johnny Weissmuller. 6'1", the right leverage, 190 pounds, Tarzan of the Apes. Just to give you an idea of the capacity of people, who do you think is breaking Johnny Weissmuller's world's records today? 13-year-old girls. 13-year-old girls. Now, if you'd ever said to Johnny Weissmuller, the Tarzan of the Apes, that a 13-year-old girl could beat him in swimming, you'd have had to battle all the apes in the jungle, I'll bet you that. There'd have been war. What is the capacity of a 13-year-old girl? Tell me. Before you tell me the power in a 13-year-old body, tell me how many muscles there are in the body. Then tell me how many atoms there are in a muscle. Then tell me the power of an atom. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't know the capacity of a person. Not even physically we don't. There is unbelievable power in us if we would use it. I think of Brutus Hamilton, the great track coach from California. He wrote a little blue book in which he said, these are the maximums. No one will ever go beyond these marks. This is how high a man can jump. This is how fast he can run. This is how strong he can be. Hardly a year went by before every one of those maximums were broken. In the sports world, records fall. Why? Because people discover new capacity. That's why these records are broken. A fellow asked me in the Rome Olympics, how many records do you think will be broken, Bob? And I said, all of them. He said, you mean all of them? I said, all of them. I was wrong. Out of several thousand events, 2 or 3 records still stood. Even in Mexico City, they claimed the altitude, these records won't fall. Practically every mark fell in the most untoward, difficult atmospheric conditions you can imagine. Why? The capacity of the human being is coming out. We don't know what it is. One of the reasons is we're conditioned by other things to believe the human being isn't very much. We're so behavioristic or so Freudian in our concepts that we can't even see the person. But the sports world and life illustrates what can happen when a person is motivated, when the capacity starts to come out. Now, you only discover your capacity when you're reaching for an enormous goal. You only use what capacity you do have when you're challenged. Most people never discover their capacity because they never try for anything. I say this, and I don't say it to be humble, but I reckon that there were over 1 million guys in America who could have beaten me in both Olympic Games. 1 million guys. Stronger, faster, but they didn't believe they could win the Olympics. They had never gotten out on a track. They had never tried. Your capacity is only discovered, ladies and gentlemen, in challenge. And the bigger your challenge, the bigger you become as a person. If you've got a little tiny goal, a little tiny challenge, you'll never make it. I think of old Cassius Clay, who used to say, I am the greatest. Now, a lot of us didn't like that. We were hoping someone was going to knock it right down his mouth, you know. I disagree with Cassius on a lot of his political ideas, but boy, I've come to appreciate this in him. You know what Cassius said? I'm the greatest. God's given me 2 of the fastest hands he ever gave any man. The best lungs, the best legs. He's given me the best personality he could give anybody. Do you know how important it is to feel that way about yourself? To feel that you've got it. Most of us say, oh no, I'm the worst. I can't do anything. I'm terrible. We wonder why we don't do anything when we don't believe we can. Can you imagine going into a boxing ring thinking, maybe I'm not the greatest? You gotta think you're the greatest. Like old Joe Namath of the Jets, man, he said, we can beat them. We're the best team. How would you like to go into a huddle and the quarterback comes in trembling and says, gee, fellas, we're really going to get stomped today. You can't think that way. You got to think that you are the greatest and go for it. Reach out for a challenge. You will be as big as your challenge. I've played a game in the past 20 years of speaking with a lot of salesmen. I said, write down on a piece of paper what you want to be in life. How rich you want to be, how many sales you want to make, what you want to be as a person. Write it down. You'd be absolutely amazed in the course of 23 years how many people have come up to me and said, Bob, I made my goal. Because they reached out for a goal. It was an enormous thing. And I tell them, make it as impossible as you can. Because the greater the challenge, the greater you will be. Every single thing in life today, you got to stretch. There is no greater example of it than the man on the moon. 10 years ago, did we have the solid fuels? I remember when Sputnik went up, we didn't even have a rocket a few years back. My Russian friends used to come over and they'd give me a little Sputnik thing with beep, 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 beep all the time. To rub it in. We're up there, you're not. We responded to the challenge, the big challenge, the biggest challenge in the history of man, landing a man on the moon first. Now, we didn't have the fuels, we didn't have the rockets, we didn't have the technology, the computers, etc., etc. But we're there now. We did it. We stretched to meet the challenge. The mind of man began to grow. I remember Buck Rogers. Remember the fairy tale of Flash Gordon, all that stuff? Impossible. Never happened. Today, it's reality. I wonder if Superman's going to have the same... I don't want to be around. Anyway, they're on the moon. They asked one of the astronauts what he thought of up there in the top of that thing, 40 stories high, as this enormous explosion goes off, you know. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, boom! And he said, what are you thinking of? And he said, to think this thing is built by the cheapest bidder. But you get my point. The mind of Americans stretched to put a man out there on the moon. Number 3. The average guy is a genius when he starts pushing the positive buttons. The capacity of a person comes to the fore when he becomes positive, when he thinks it can be done. When instead of thinking negatively, he starts to say, I know I can do it. The power of positive thinking. I've been in sports for 25 years, ladies and gentlemen. I've seen things you wouldn't believe. I've seen young kids come along, fat, sloppy kids who say, I'm going to be a champion. You look at them and you say, kid, you can't be a champion. Dunk apples because you got a lot of weight to hold me. That kid that I thought couldn't be a champion is Billie Jean Moffitt, greatest woman tennis player in the world. I remember being in Innsbruck, Austria, a little tiny, skinny-legged, chicken-legged girl. That big her legs. She came skating up to me, great big eyes, tears running down her face, and she said, Mr. Richards, I'm going to win a gold medal for America 4 years from now. Well, now, what would you have said to a 14-year-old skinny girl? Her ice skates weighed more than she did. What would you have said to her? I wish I could tell you I threw my arm around her and said, honey, you're going to be a champion. I looked at her and I thought, golly, kid, if you were only bigger, you could do it. 2 years later, I went to the Broadmoor Hotel in Colorado Springs. I watched her skating, turning, sow-chowing, triple sow-chowing, the whole bit. Her legs were beginning to expand. She was stretching, see. She was getting strong. You know what I mean? Strong. 4 years from the time she said that to me, she won the only gold medal America won in the last Olympic Games. Tears streaming down her face again, Star-Spangled Banner playing. I won it for my country, I won it for my mother, I won it for myself. Don't tell me the power of positive thinking isn't there. I've seen average kids, fat, skinny, name it. I've seen them get a dream, and I've seen their bodies transformed by that dream. I've seen them go to the top when they believe that they can do it. What happened to Willie Mays when Leo DeRocher said, you're going to be the greatest baseball player the world's ever known? By the way, he's 5'10", weighs 175 pounds. Rocky Marciano, the greatest heavyweight who ever lived, 5'10", 185 pounds. These are average guys who get motivated. They believe they can do it. They push the positive buttons. They become champions. But if you want to know the secrets to success for an average guy, start pushing the positive buttons. Believe you can do it. And you can. If you don't think so, let me leave you with a story. I went to give a speech in Boston not too long ago to a life insurance group, and just before I got up to speak, they wheeled up onto the platform a man on a stretcher. They had just taken him out of the iron lung. His name was Dick Chappitt. And they wheeled him up in front of this microphone. And speaking like this, he said, I am so glad to be here. It's hard for me to talk, but I got something I want to tell you. Every dream I've ever wanted in my life, I've been able to achieve. Can you believe this? Flat on his back, crippled, an iron lung every night, talking about achieving every dream. And he talked about the TOYM program here in St. Paul, Minnesota. He talked about Ed White and Pete Conrad and Bill Moyers and some of the great ones, how they'd been able to achieve their dream in America. He said, for example, I always wanted to write a book. He said, I tape recorded every day for a year. 11 tapes. When we were through, I wanted to hear it played back. They were all blank. He said, it's hard for me to talk, you know. But we started over. Today, my book is published. I wanted to be a speaker. I've given 200 speeches last year. I wanted to be president of a club, and I'm president. Every dream I've ever wanted, I've been able to achieve. And then he said, one of the TOYM winners was a guy named Herman who wrote Annie Main. The basic theme of that is life is a banquet. Most of us are starving to death. Can you believe this? And then he paused for a minute and he said, every day is so exciting for me. I love life. It's a banquet. Go out and live it and partake of it. When you do, think of me. Crippled, beaten down, he has gone to the top. What can you and I do? Average Joes with legs and arms and lungs and brains, if we'll use the great capacity we've got. Thank you very much. Thank you. You're wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.